Hello, everyone. Philip Lee returning with another episode of Civil War Chat. Today is Election Day, November 8th, 2022. Click on the subscribe button down here in the lower right to subscribe to future episodes and also the notification bell in the far upper right. If you click on that, not only will you be notified when the episodes are released, but your candidates will win the election today. So, our topic today is wartime trade between the North and the South. On June 7th, 1863, the Confederate commerce raider Clarence forced the U.S. flagged Alfred H. Partridge to stop off the North Carolina coast. The raider anticipated that Partridge would be the second of an eventual string of 21 prizes. Normally, seized merchant ships were burned or used to transport previously captured crews to a safe harbor. But upon boarding the schooner, the rebels discovered it was bound for Matamoras, Mexico, out of New York, with a cargo of arms and clothing for Texas Confederates. Consequently, the Partridge was set free. Since Matamoras was a neutral Mexican port, federal warships could not blockade it. Before the Civil War, only about one ship annually cleared the New York harbor for the Mexican town. However, a year after the war's first important battle at Bull Run, the average was about one per week. Cargoes included a multitude of northern-made items that would have been considered contraband if shipped directly into the Confederacy. They encompassed weapons, munitions, and military uniforms, among other articles. For Northerners willing to help arm the Confederacy for a profit, Matamoras was little more than a legal fig leaf to cover dubious, if not treasonable, conduct. In exchange, Southern planters provided cotton from fields as far away as Arkansas, Louisiana, and East Texas. They typically loaded wagons with 20 cotton bales and set out in caravans over crude trails, ending in Brownsville, Texas, across the shallow Rio Grande from Matamoras. En route, teamsters were vulnerable to unpredictable water shortages and attack from hostile Indians and outlaws of all types. Next to gold, cotton was perhaps the most acceptable international exchange medium available to North Americans, whether they were in the Union or the Confederacy. Adroit and clever contraband-for-cotton traders accumulated fortunes in Matamoras and Brownsville. One example was Connecticut-born Charles Stillman, who sold rebel cotton out of Matamoras to buyers in the northern states, including the U.S. government. His chief cotton supplier was a putative cotton-loyal Texan who changed sides after the federal troops temporarily occupied Brownsville in November 1863. In order to prevent interference from the newly arrived Yankee soldiers, he swore an oath of loyalty to the Union. After the war, Stillman was one of the wealthiest of Americans and a major shareholder in New York's National City Bank. His son, a grandson, and a great-grandson served as National City's board chairman. The great-grandson as late as 1967. That great-grandson also lived until 2002. Presently, the bank is known as Citicorp. Two of Charles Stillman's granddaughters also married into the Rockefeller family. Despite its legal circumvention advantages, Matamoras was a comparatively minor part of Civil War interbelligerent trade. More often, the exchange was directly across enemy lines. The practice became important in the spring of 1862 after the cotton trading centers at New Orleans and Memphis were captured. When Union Major General Benjamin Butler arrived in New Orleans with 15,000 occupation soldiers in May of 1862, his net worth was about $150,000. But 6 years later, it was $3 million. Although the lawyer general was too shrewd to incriminate himself, there is little doubt the gain was primarily achieved by trade with the enemy. By the summer of 1862, Union Major General William T. Sherman at Memphis complained that Northern traders were buying Southern cotton for gold, which the rebels next used to buy weapons at Nassau in the Bahamas, or even Cincinnati. In August 1862, he sent a letter to his brother, Senator John Sherman. And he wrote, quote, Cincinnati furnishes more contraband goods than the leading blockade running port of Charleston and has done more to prolong the war than the entire state of South Carolina, close quote. A few months later, Major General Ulysses Grant captured Confederate cavalry in northern Mississippi armed with modern carbines, evidently purchased at occupied Memphis. Ladies were not excluded from such trade and were sometimes especially effective. They were generally held less accountable for violations, and soldiers were hesitant to physically search them. For example, Union Captain Julius Ox was assigned to a unit guarding the St. Louis to Cincinnati Railroad when his wife was caught trying to smuggle quinine in a baby carriage across the Ohio River to rebels in Kentucky. Somehow Captain Ox got the charges dropped, but his wife's dedication to the South persisted. After the war, she joined the United Daughters of the Confederacy, while her husband became a member of the Grand Army of the Republic, which was a Union veterans organization. Their eldest son, Adolph, was a Chattanooga newspaperman after the war, but shortly before the turn of the 19th to the 20th century, Adolph bought a failing New York newspaper, added the words, quote, all the news that's fit to print, close quote, to its masthead and launched the New York Times. At that time, toward national prominence, not the biased rag that it is today. Men require a noble calling to enlist as soldiers that must shoot to kill strangers who normally have done them no harm. In the spring of 1861, the concept of union became sufficiently gallant to qualify as such a calling in the North. In truth, however, the North wanted an intact union in order to sustain its emerging economic supremacy. Without the South's raw materials and favorable export trade balance, business leaders in the North justifiably worried that the economies of the states remaining in the Union after Southern secession might collapse. The Northern economy was generally dependent upon selling goods they produced domestically, whereas the South exported most of its goods. You see the difference? Northern economy had to sell their goods within the USA. South could sell their goods outside the USA. That made the North more vulnerable to disunion than it did the South, considerably more. And this point is largely overlooked by most academic historians because of their focus on trying to blame the South for everything. 10 days before South Carolina led the Southern states into secession, on December 20th, 1860, the Chicago Daily Times editorialized on the calamities of disunion. In a single blow, our foreign commerce must be reduced to less than one half of what it is now. Our coastwise trade would pass into other hands. One half of our shipping would be idle. We would lose our trade with the South with all of its immense profits. Our manufactories would be in utter ruins. If our protective tariff be wholly withdrawn from our labor, it could not compete with the labor of Europe. We should be driven from the market, and millions of our people would be compelled to go out of employment. To understand how a dissected union, bereft of between the lines trading, could lead to economic collapse in the North, it is necessary to examine world cotton markets on the eve of the Civil War, as well as commercial relations between the North and South. Cotton textile manufacturing was the world's biggest industry, and it was largely dependent upon the Southern states for feedstock. Southern cotton alone accounted for 60% of all U.S. exports. A truncated country composed solely of northern states could not hope to maintain a favorable international balance of payments. The situation would be exacerbated if the southern states ceased to be a market for northern manufactured goods, which would be likely given the Confederacy's adoption of lower import tariffs. The North sold $360 million worth of manufactured goods and services to the South in 1860. They would lose most of that market to European imports if the South seceded, because a low tariff Confederacy would enable the European imports to underprice the Yankee-made goods. Contrary to popular belief, therefore, it was the North that went to war over tariffs, not the South. They went to war over tariffs because they wanted to keep tariffs high in the South, thereby keeping the Southern market exclusive to the Northern manufacturers. Because trade between the belligerents was almost a certainty, each side adopted regulations to control it in a manner optimal to their own interests. Generally, Confederate President Jefferson Davis looked the other way out of necessity, whereas Lincoln looked the other way out of policy. While the Confederate Congress tried to restrict the export of cotton to the North, it never outlawed trade with the states remaining in the Union. It was silent on the matter of imports from the Union because of the necessities of life were often readily available to more readily available to Southern civilians on the far side of enemy lines than through the blockade. The regulations of Lincoln's government were more convoluted because of conflicting interests. Prohibition on trade would leave destitute whites and former slaves in the federally occupied regions of the Confederate States with no means of economic support. But less altruistically, New England mills wanted feedstock to keep their factories running and their workers employed. For diplomatic reasons, Lincoln also wanted enough cotton to slip out of the country in order to avoid a cotton famine in Europe that might otherwise provoke Old World intervention in the American War. Contrary to popular belief, cargoes entering the Confederacy through the Union maritime blockade were not necessarily from Europe. Although about twice as much cotton reached the North across enemy lines as was shipped to Europe through the blockade, it is important to realize that some merchants in the northern states also traded through the blockade. One method was to ship cargoes to Halifax, Nova Scotia, where they could be converted into, quote, Canadian cotton, Canadian, quote, Canadian merchandise prior to running the blockade to the Confederacy. On return, Confederate bales could be transformed into, quote, Canadian cotton at Halifax and then shipped to New York. In sum, the Confederacy benefited more from the interbelligerent trade during the war than did the North, and the practice also lengthened the war. While there were admittedly some altruistic, diplomatically acceptable reasons for Northerners to engage in such trade, the chief motivation was mercenary gain to be derived from the extraordinary profitability. During the war, cotton prices climbed as high as $1.90 a pound, compared to 13 cents prior to the war. That's more than a 10-to-1 increase. For those willing to set aside morality in exchange for personal economic advantage, the profits were irresistible, particularly when favored access to available inventories could be secured by means of political connections, bribery, and military status. Efforts to stop it were as futile as King Canute's command to hold back the waves. Okay, I would like to share with you here. Give me a second. All right, this is my book, cover of my book, Trading with the Enemy, which is what, we've just talked about. I recommend it. The book is $28, available at Amazon and Barnes and Noble. It's going to tell you about a dark side of the Civil War that is not much written about. Now, of course, the academics dominate the book publishing when it comes to the Civil War. And they really don't want to talk about anything that reflects unfavorably upon the North. Well, this interbelligerent trade definitely reflects unfavorably upon the North. And I do disclose in here an incident in which a senator from Rhode Island may well have been directly involved in trading weapons with the Confederacy. So I recommend Trading with the Enemy by Philip Lee, $28 at Amazon, Barnes and Noble. I think you're gonna, if you get it, I think you're gonna like it, and it's going to give you a lot of information that you will not get from most academic historians. Okay, today is election day. Go out there and vote for your candidate, and I hope that you'll vote for candidates that will want to keep Confederate monuments in place. That's our show for today. Thanks for watching. I look forward to seeing you next time.